Okay, so this is a session called Results That Matter, and it's about something called co-production, and that as it relates to another thing called time banking. So we thought that the first thing that we should find out is who's in the room, who, by asking you, how many of you actually are familiar with time banking? A lot of you. How many are very familiar, have actually done time banking? 2 of you, that's wonderful. How many have no knowledge of time banking at all? Okay, a small number. So let me share with you the agenda that we had, because the topic wasn't so very well spelled out in the guide, that the co-production and the system change that we're looking at relates pretty closely to time banking. So here's the agenda that we have. We would first wanted to find who's in the room, and then actually give you a notion, talk about what time banking is, just in a nutshell. So you get to get a quick view of time banking, and you'll understand quickly why it's a quick view of time banking, because time banking has become really a vehicle for innovation, social innovation, and is morphing in many different and interesting directions, which are leading to social change, system change, and one stream of that systems change is called co-production, and is some of the work that we're doing at the University of District Columbia with various time banks around the country and on various fronts and fields, and also with organizations in the UK, including the New Economics Foundation, was picked up co-production and really run with it over there. So the very first thing on the list is time banking in a nutshell. And time banking is a medium of exchange, basically, where people mutually agree that if they do something for somebody, they will earn a time credit for every hour. Basically, often it's every act that they will do for somebody else. And then when somebody does something for somebody else, they earn a time credit. It's just as simple as that. You earn for doing for others, and you spend when you need things done. But from that very, very simple core basis have grown all kinds of structures. It's always an hour for an hour for an hour, always an equal basis. So undergirding that are 5 core principles. Everyone has something to offer. The work of building community is real work. Reciprocity, you give and receive, so you always want to be part of a giving and receiving dynamic. Community is stronger, we're all stronger together, and finally, every human being deserves respect. So that is time banking in a nutshell. Are there any sort of questions on the time banking in a nutshell bit? So, because we'll move into these more concretely. I'm going to pass over to Edgar, and he's going to tell you why he created time banking in the first place and what he hoped to achieve.
Now, first, we're here because we're aware of what money does. Money puts supply and demand together, and it rewards, and it does so by rewarding competition. Most of us have heard of another medium of exchange called grades and academic credits, and that rewards learning, and it puts capacity and supply together. We have other mediums of exchange called loyalty points and frequent flyer points, which reward other kinds of conduct called loyalty to brands. We have had no medium of exchange that rewards caring, sharing, or building community. But if you think of the power of a medium of exchange to alter conduct and create new institutions, you'll understand why, to get results that matter in that domain, another medium of exchange may be useful. My own experience and the reason that I created time banking was I was lying in a hospital bed with a heart attack that I was told had destroyed 60% of my heart, and I was receiving excellent care, but I was feeling useless. And that was 1980, and there were a lot of other people we were declaring useless. There was the recession, so the people in Detroit who were being let off, the teenagers who couldn't get jobs, the folks in Appalachia, the folks on Native American reservations, they were feeling useless too. And I thought, why can't we create another medium of exchange to put useless people together with the social problems? Because Reagan had just come in and declared all of these programs were going to be cut, and there was no point to spending money on that. So we had a whole lot of useless people. Well, right now, we have a whole lot more people who are useless, and I thought, no, they're not useless. We need to find another way of honoring the capacity that people have. If you ask yourself, what portion of you is reflected on your resume, if it's even 5%, I would be surprised. Most of you do not put on your resume, to my knowledge, that you know how to tie your shoes. But nonetheless, for a preschooler, that would be a very useful capacity to help them learn how to tie their shoes. And we've used time banking to have 5th and 6th graders tutor 1st and 2nd graders in the alphabet, because when in Washington, D.C., more than 50% of the kids in 3rd grade are not at 3rd grade reading level, which means they walk into 4th grade when they're expected to be able to read without that capacity. So we have vast untapped capacity, and if we're talking about what are the tools we have to change the future, to produce different kinds of futures, then what you're going to hear is that a different medium of exchange makes it possible to tap the vast untapped capacity that we have. And I think probably that's as much of the story. The problem then was how to put that together, and we needed a different medium of exchange, but fortunately, that was at the beginning of the computer revolution. So we had DBase and then FoxPro, but we used different languages because we needed to know what this untapped capacity was, and then we needed to find a way to put that untapped capacity together with unmet needs. So we were dealing with social isolation, but we were dealing with social problems, and we had vast capacity, but we had no way of knowing where it was or whom you could trust, or what would happen if you put capacity and need together, and could you trust people, because we were all living on top of each other as strangers. And so what I think you're going to hear is that now in 34 countries and in more than 40 states, this medium of exchange is now electronically available on the internet to begin to put untapped capacity, vast untapped capacity, together with unmet needs to do everything from dealing with social problems of different sorts to really dealing with the sustainability of the planet.
So just to give you a little sense, are there any people remaining in the room who are actually doing time banking? Not now. Okay. So there's actually various kinds of time banking. There's time banks that are neighborhood-based, neighbors helping neighbors. There's many of those. They're the majority at the moment, but there are other kinds of time banks that have very targeted purposes. Like there's a time bank in Rhode Island that is for children and families where the children have severe emotional disorders, and traditionally they've gone into the juvenile justice.
Bipolar or schizophrenic or have autism, yeah.
What in adults you would call mental illness, and in children they call emotional disorders. So they would, in the past, they've gone into the juvenile justice system, they've gone into residential homes, they've gone into foster care, and the results for those children and those families are very bad. So the Parent Support Network in Rhode Island adopted time banking as a system change model to actually engage the families and the children in creating an economy and a system that actually supports their needs. So that actually has been so successful that it's now been written into the state best practices for Rhode Island as a best practice for dealing with children with severe emotional disorders and their families. And it's beginning to get federal funding to be taken elsewhere around the country. So that's one of the sort of specialized. In New York, the Visiting Nurses Association has, with its great capacity to fund this, has been funding time banks that are oriented to supplementing the work of visiting nurses. And their goal is to actually have time banking across the city of New York. They now have it in how many neighborhoods? It's growing and spreading.
Four neighborhoods, they have 3,000 members.
So it's growing neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood. And the strategy was, let's start with one neighborhood, then build it into another and another and another. And in the very first neighborhood that they started, it was so diverse, and the populations were so mutually isolated. There were these little pockets, and everyone was isolated, isolated, isolated. Now they call it actually the United Nations, because the Time Bank just bridges this currency of caring, bridges so many different communities that it's just this hodgepodge of diversity in there. So that's another example. In Lehigh Valley, it's used by a hospital, and it's groundbreaking work in palliative care, and looks to be a model that may be taken across the nation for hospice, palliative care for people with severe and chronic illnesses.
So I'm just going to share a couple of examples from the UK where there has been a huge uptake of time banking in about the last 2 years, since we had a change of government about 2 years ago. Some of you may be familiar with the context of what's going on in the UK. It's fairly similar to the US right now, a big retreat of the state, an austerity package, which is cutting public spending a huge amount. And we've obviously traditionally had a much stronger welfare state than the US, and that is really being reined back. And this kind of crisis of state funding has really led to a lot of people to look to alternative strategies and how we might design and deliver services better. And there are a few innovations in time banking that I just wanted to touch upon here, because as I said, there has been a huge interest, and there's a lot of investment at the moment, so there's a new momentum around it. One organisation in Camden is taking this hour-for-hour time bank model and applying it to an organisational level, so that the spare capacity and resources that sit within the not-for-profit sector, the local public sector, the private sector, can be harnessed and brought in and enable people to change their hour time credits, for example, for an hour's swimming at the local pool, a trip to the cinema at an off-peak time on a Wednesday afternoon, for example. And so that organisations can identify resources that they have that are underutilised. For example, we have a school bus, which we actually only use on Monday afternoons, and what we really need is meeting space. So if we can start to identify that spare capacity and pool it and begin to link it up with a time trading system, it enables us all to get access to a huge amount more resources. And you move from a model of deficit where we don't have a lot of money, and we think that leads us with not very much, to a model of abundance where we can start to identify where there is spare capacity and bring it in. Another model which is being developed is called Hackney Shares. That's in an area of northeast London where I live. And they've started thinking about how they might link up local time banks. The time banking has always been very local, and people often identify with it on a very kind of neighbourhood basis. But people move beyond that, and there are huge benefits to be able to take your time credits and trade them somewhere else outside your immediate locality. So they're setting up a network time bank model where you might have 10 to 15 local time banks, but they are linked together so that you can trade within them. So I could earn a time credit in my neighbourhood and go to the other side of the borough and spend it over there, which historically you weren't able to do. So keeping it local, but enabling you to link into resources on a national level. And more broadly speaking, there's a huge proliferation of time banking in the public sector. So in health agencies, in social care agencies, and housing agencies, people are starting to develop time banks as a way of transforming public services. We work with a huge number of practitioners, frontline people who work in the community and in public services, and they're starting to use time banking in really innovative ways. One housing co-op that we've worked with have taken the model and used it as a core part of their income. So they've now just published accounts where they've got 30% of their income in time credits, and they've used that to develop their websites, to run a lot of their comms and marketing activity. And I think they're starting to show how you can really take this idea of changing one time credit for time credit and turn it into a very viable business model in some cases for them as a way of operating and generating the kind of support that they want to for local people when funding is, as I said, increasingly retreating and becoming scarce. So that's just a few examples from the UK.
In time banking, all hours are equal, and that represents a statement about value. Price defines value by what's scarce. So if it's scarce, it's valuable. If it's abundant, it's cheaper. If it's really abundant, it's worthless. Which means that every capacity that defines you and me as a human being, we have devalued. And if we're here to talk about the kind of world that we want to create, we thought maybe we ought to start valuing what it means to be the best human being we can be, a caring human being, a human being who cares about the planet. Universal. It's not scarce to want to care, to want to fight social injustice, to want to make sure that we trust each other. All those are universal. So we have devalued every capacity we need to create the kind of world that we're here to try and create. And that's why we thought we needed a different medium of exchange to tap those universal capacities to speak, to care, to hug, to teach each other the alphabet, to promote literacy, and to fight, and to make something called democracy work, which wasn't about scarcity. So we're saying maybe we need to think differently if we're going to get different results, and maybe we need a different medium of exchange that incorporates and stands for different values. And that's, so I would say that maybe we ought to open it for questions now, but I wanted to lay that out as a statement about to do this means that you are rejecting market pricing as the sole definition of value.
How does this compare to the alternate money approaches in script or whatever?
That is a great question because it's sort of got half a foot in there and half a foot not. And one of the, Edgar will answer this more and so will Julia, but I'll give you my answer first, which is when you get into the time banking world, those who are deeply in it, if you go to a time banking conference, people are just zoom from the minute they get up till the time they go to bed, exploring possibilities and learning about the way that you use this. Really, what David Boyle, who's at the back there, wrote a book called Funny Money, and it is a kind of funny money because it doesn't have price in it. Most monies have price in it. And because it has no price in it, it lives in this sort of in-between space. I call it in the cracks of so many of the things that we've created. It's not volunteering, it's not like real money. So it's a little bit like other currencies because it is a medium of exchange, but it's not like most other currencies because there's no price factor in there. It's an hour for an hour for an hour.
Most alternative currencies track in some ways market prices. So it's a negotiated bartering currency where my time as a carpenter is worth more than your time as a high school student and more than your time as an elementary student who can teach the alphabet. Local currencies are an attempt to keep and those alternative currencies are powerful in an attempt to stop the drain of money out of community, but they don't necessarily they aren't taking the same position of value that time banking is, that says every hour you've got is the most precious thing that you have. And to create that kind of a world, we need both kinds of value. We need the value of neighbors helping neighbors, of kids helping other kids, of teenagers using their power of peer approval to support, of seniors who want to stay out of nursing homes, but who can give by talking to each other and giving each other companionship. So we're talking about two different worlds, and that's what got us to invent something called co-production, because in fact, we need, in effect, both the world that utilizes scarce capacity of varying sorts with different kinds of values, and a world that can also enlist the universal capacities that we have as human beings. So we needed to find a way to bridge those two worlds, and we call that co-production.
That was just the point I was about to make, which is that it might be useful. Sorry. It might be useful at this point to introduce that concept of co-production. The other thing to say, I think it differs from other complementary currencies in its aim and in its function. So many other complementary currencies would be primarily economic, whereas time banking and time credits in the UK certainly, and I think largely in the US, have usually been seen as being social in function and as a bridge between what we might call the core economy and the state. In the UK, the concept of time co-production is very closely linked to public services, and that's perhaps most appropriate to our concept. So we would see co-production as a way of designing and delivering services with people and professionals. Historically, we've tried to do things to people that we see as problems and trying to fix them. Co-production sees people as having a much more active role, and time banking is a way to involve, engage, and reward their involvement in supporting each other and in supporting the delivery of services. So it primarily has a social function. A lot of the other local currencies have got, as Edgar said, they're more concerned with local economic flows. But there are lots of different, what they call typologies of complementary currencies, and lots of people have written about different ways in which you might organise or store those. So there's a kind of a certain amount of debate around it as well, I would say.
I'd like to make one more distinction, which is here in the United States. The more and more emphasis has been on the free market, the market to solve our problems, and a sort of de-emphasis on the state and government programs. However, of course, the government programs are still massive. They're huge. They play a very important role in what Edgar and I used to call, and still do sometimes, the public purpose economy. So it's a market economy, a public purpose economy. And then there's this other strange thing of people helping one another we call the core economy. In Britain, where NEF operates, the public purpose economy is much more publicly supported, discussed, accepted as a part of the national economic picture than it is here. And time banking finds itself, as Julia said, as sort of being associated with the public purpose economy in many interesting ways. At the moment, more, I would say, than it does with the market economy. So the video that you're going to see in a moment is about the public purpose economy. Yes, please.
Could you give us an example of co-production?
Yes, the youth court that Edgar just shared with you, where the young people are actually young people who've been arrested, are brought before a jury of their peers. Those peers who sit on the jury and hear the cases of people who are doing things that they had been arrested for a few months before, they're co-producing justice, juvenile justice, and they're supported. That program was supported by the Superior Court in DC. There are youth courts now going on all over the place, so they're helping to co-produce the outcomes that are being sought.
And in Washington, D.C., persons who are returning from prison that we've organized, Chris and I work with them to create what they call a Homecomers Academy that is dealing both with their educational background and needs and their substance abuse issues, but they in turn are providing safe passage every morning to kids across gang territory who otherwise wouldn't get to school because they're afraid, and we have huge truancy problems. So it's that kind of cooperation between what they can do, the ways in which they can give, and the ways in which government has to perform functions or community needs those functions. That's what we call co-production. We call it really a partnership between the economy of money that's spent for public purposes and the economy of community, the core economy of household, neighborhood, and just of plain old people. And that's what this video is going to portray. So if you can show that, it's about a 5-minute video that will give you a sense of what co-production is and why we felt, because it's now viewed as the cutting edge way of dealing with systems that don't work and of system change, because we have all kinds of programs that are doing and not doing. They're trying, but they're inadequate to deal with the problems. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the most interesting ways it's being used, again in London actually, there's so many interesting ways that co-production and time banking are being used in harness now, the idea of co-production and the tool of time banking. So in London, Julia just spoke about Camden Shares, which was exchanges between organizations in a community called Camden. That time bank was actually started up simultaneously with another time bank that was started within a homeless shelter. And the homeless shelter had very specific needs, and it dealt with people who were homeless, people who had mental illness of some kind, and also refugees. So this homeless shelter was hardly being used at all, and they decided that they would introduce time banking to see if they could stimulate really ownership and use and development of a community in this homeless shelter. But they wanted to do simultaneously the development of that capacity within the shelter and the development of the capacity outside of the shelter, so that as these two things grew in parallel, there would come a time when naturally you would start having exchanges flow between the two, from within and in the surrounding community. And that is now beginning to happen, where these two sources of very different kind of energy and capacity are beginning to flow together. And it's a very exciting exciting development to see how this homeless shelter has become a dynamic, interactive, creative community where people who had, as what you would call the throwaway people in the past, used to come as passive recipients of sort of services and handouts, and now driving the community centre, making things happen, and they're connecting to the wider community in an amazingly dynamic way. So that's just an example of the co-production that's being described here. And it was actually the people who created that program, those two time banks, who created this film based on a chapter out of Edgar's book. Okay, so.
About developing the tools to do the job, the equipment, the institutional capacity, professional expertise. And they set about understanding the blobs better, because how could they help if they didn't understand the problem? They invested in the process for solving problems, and they invested in the infrastructure for solving problems. But no matter how much the squares tried to reach out into the community and understand the root causes of the problems, they never managed it. They really weren't able to get to where the problems were. They were, well, just too squarish. Oh dear, the government squares said to the little squares, this isn't working. And it wasn't. A gulf still separated the squares from the blobs. It wasn't working because however well they understood the problems simply weren't theirs. And no matter how hard they tried, the problems just wouldn't stand still. We've invested all this money, said the government, created all this expertise, built all this resource, but it still hasn't worked. And so they tried to bridge the gulf by asking the little squares to find blobs they could partner with. And so the little squares invited the blobs that seemed like they had the energy, vitality, and the drive to make a difference to work with them and sit on their boards as representatives. This time, they didn't just experiment on the blobs, they asked the blobs what they wanted and what they thought and how life should be. But this approach made the blob unhappy because it seemed to reinforce the difference even more. Oh dear, the squares said, this still isn't working. So they tried giving some of the money directly to grassroots organizations that were very blobby. They must be able to solve the problem, they thought, because you can't get closer to the problem than that. But to be trusted with the money, the blobs had to produce reports, attend training sessions, and write risk assessments. And by the time the blobs had done all this, something strange happened to the blobs and had become little squares. And by the blobs becoming squarish, they lost everything that made them blobs. Their energy, grassroots connections, vitality. And something more important happened. They became neither blobs nor squares. They lost their sense of what made them who they are. And they lost their sense that they could do something to help, that they could solve problems, and that they had an idea of how to make the world a better place. We think there is a different way. We think the squares are really good at some things, and we think the blobs are really good at others. We think co-production is a different way for squares and blobs to work together. While the squares may well be the experts in the process, the blobs have something equally important and something the solution needs: the context. Co-production is a partnership where the process and context have equal value, where squares and blobs need and value each other for who they are and what they can give. One is not more important or valuable than the other. It isn't about imposing a solution on the problem. Instead, it is about understanding that the solution can only lie in the problem. It is only through a process where the assets of both the squares and blobs are valued equally that great things can happen. Each one of us has a strength. As a professional is more than their job title, a person is more than their problem. Co-production matters! To find out more about co-production and a new way to do business, go to www.nomorethrowaywaypeople.com.
If you think of what we're trained to do in schools, we're trained to be squares, and we're trained to apply square questions. Then we invented something called service learning, where we actually send the students out into the community and maybe they tell the professors what the hell's going on in the real world, and they try and figure out the solutions, and then the professors write the papers about what the students have taught them. And so what we're saying is that in different forms, you will be seeing at the cutting edge of any government agency you're dealing with, of any nonprofit you're dealing with, of any formal organization you're dealing with, you will see some version of this problem between, hey, we've come with a solution, but we can't get there without enlisting the community in raising hell, in forcing the politicians to listen to us, in monitoring pollution, in monitoring the way in which money is being extracted. So this problem of squares and blobs is a kind of generic problem that applies to all of the things that we've been looking at here in terms of what's the future. Because the future we're going to have to talk about is what is work. And believe it or not, work involves things like raising children, keeping families strong, building trust, building community, caring about the environment, turning people out for elections, holding officials accountable when they are elected, dealing with global poverty, and understanding that we can't deal with it by putting money out there if we can't enlist those communities and those nations to be part of the solution. So that co-production is a way of saying, hey, there's a monetary economy that works in its way, whether we use alternative currencies or not. It still deals with issues of scarcity and hierarchies of value and hierarchies of structure. They may be better, they may be less destructive than the hierarchies we have now, but unless we can find a way to honor the contributions of the elderly, of the kids, of what we call the throwaway people, the people who aren't, quote, working, until we find a way to honor that, we can't get to those solutions. So we don't have to say expertise is wrong, professionals are wrong, or knowledge is wrong, but we do have to say that knowledge has to be a catalyst that enlists those who are not part of that world to change the world that they're living in. And anybody who's dealt with the question of how we get people to change their lifestyles understands that all kinds of lectures about nutrition and all kinds of lectures about other good things, we heard that last night from Alicia, won't get us there unless we can find new ways to enlist them. And so co-production is our way of saying, hey, there are different domains of knowledge, of expertise, of specialization, but there are also different domains of value that we need to put to the real work of living day by day.
Questions or comments? Yes, please.
It's fascinating. I love this stuff. I've been studying restorative practices, and this is right in that school of thought. I don't know if you're aware of it at all. But in any case, an interesting conclusion that maybe you reached, I don't know. Communities have always been smarter than the smartest thing out there, given a critical mass. And could you describe this shift from old economy to new economy being a shift from thinking the expert is the smartest to the community is the smartest?
I think that I wouldn't want to say that either one has all the knowledge. I think that there's...
Well, the expert's a member of the community.
If the experts understand that there is wisdom in the community and that the community collectively may have better insights, but even if the community doesn't have the best insights, they may be the only ones who can make the change. So having knowledge that nobody uses isn't very helpful. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in and interrupt him. I think that the critical thing here is expertise is so often wrapped into formal systems. And formal systems have a dynamic and a drive of their own, where even where experts realize that what they're doing isn't working, in fact, they're responding to incentives that are driven by the system that they're in. And so a lot of what we're doing, and I think Julia could well talk to this with Neff, a lot of what we're in is exploring how the dynamics of the time bank in the blobs builds up a sort of set of expertise and energy at a sort of systemic level that can speak to the expert systems, so that you're actually looking at not just individuals dislocated from structures and systems, but you're looking at everything in context. That's why that word context came in, that there's an understanding that everything is contextual. So those experts are speaking from a system, and they're now encountering community that's organizing itself, driving possibilities systemically as well as individually. Yes, please. Oh, and Julia, did you want to add to that?
I would just briefly say that I think that it's not about one or the other. And for us, in the UK certainly, there is a perception at the moment, as I explained a bit about the context earlier, big retreat of the state and an expectation that we will have something called a big society in return, which is that people will get together and do things themselves. And that is very much based on the assumption that the people are the experts, and that they should have the freedom and opportunity to just get on and do things. But the state also has a role, and I think what we often forget is that at the moment we have a system where we try and do things to people and try and fix people, but you can't deliver outcomes to people. I think it was Edgar and many others said, you can't deliver pizza, like you can't deliver outcomes like you deliver pizza to people. You can't just give them good health. If you go to a doctor in the UK, you have 8 to 10 minutes with them, and very often you will leave without necessarily getting what you want from it. And I suppose when we talk about co-production, we're trying to describe a system where the role of the professional changes, so that they're trying to build up people's skill and capacity, and actually link them into other resources so that they might go away and be able to help develop those outcomes separately from the state, if that makes sense. So I don't think it's an either or, and the debate in the UK at the moment seems to be that polarisation, that it's either the state will do it or communities will do it themselves. And what we would try and articulate is that actually co-production is the middle ground. It's the bringing together of the resources of the core economy and all of the outcomes that the community already produce well away from public services, but harnessing that and bringing it together with what the state does have, the resources, the assets, crucially, money, funding, finance, the buildings, the expertise, the trained professionals, and there is still very much a role for professionals. And it's about bringing those two together and working in a slightly different way, I think.
What do you think it would take to create a public education system that supports co-productive thinking at its core and doing?
Lots of conversations to start up. I would, and that actually isn't a facetious argument. A lot of this is actually people sitting down with good ideas and starting very small and trying things out. For the last 10 years, it's been a massive, time banking has been a massive social experiment. There have been many fails, but if you think of it in Edisonian terms, and the light bulb, how many 999 light bulbs before you got. Many time banks have grown, many have fallen, some have gone on to do wonderful things, and they've tried things out. So it takes actually crowdsourcing in a different way, coming together, bringing people together with ideas, and just saying, let's figure things out and try it out. I think that's personally the first step. You'll have, and then we'll get to your question.
Older kids teaching younger kids works. Now on the internet, there are also in a site called Power My Learning, games that correspond to every learning objective from K through 12 put together by an Ashoka fellow who's daring to bring parents and kids together and the internet and coaching them to use that. So that I think that we need to engage the consumer as the co-producer of knowledge and of learning. And I think we need to do that systematically, and you get paradigm shift changes when people understand that the present paradigm isn't working. And in case you hadn't noticed, the present paradigm is not working very well.
That was a little bit of a cheat question, I think, too, because it came from an Ashoka fellow, and they have, yes?
I work with Ashoka.
Oh, works with Ashoka. And they have a university that's aiming to do...
To create change makers.
To create change makers. So.
My first thinking in listening to all of this is about funders. I'm the co-director of a nonprofit program, and we sort of sound like a time banking organization when I'm listening to this. We're very collective, we're very reciprocal. We really are multifaceted. We take advantage of abundances and redistribute, and we do a lot of those things. And funders don't know what to do with us. They want to know, are you a jobs program? Are you an environmental program? why are you doing that when you were doing that yesterday? I'm just wondering if you found any either framings or sort of ways to communicate it that bring people sort of stuck in an older sort of siloed paradigm that communicates or translates those ideas.
So this is a huge topic. It's something that we grapple with here, and I'm sure they do in the UK too. And I'll just say that time banking is a kind of spanning thing, and it's been very, very, very hard to talk with funders. We actually do have one, the Rudolf Steiner Foundation has been an amazing support for us, who was willing to sort of not go into that siloized mold and actually work with us on creating a kind of embracing, spanning tool like this. But we have found that actually the foundations are so stuck in an old paradigm of service delivery that, or if not service delivery, then sort of siloized problems, because then they can bring their expertise to these problems, that it's been actually very, very, very challenging. But I'll pass it to Edgar and see what you...
Yeah, I'm saying there are funders who will to do this. It takes money to fund the infrastructure to generate the community involvement, and some funders will fund you if you're saying this is about system change. This is about turning, quote, consumers of services into co-workers and co-producers and co-helpers. And it needs to be articulated as a form of system change, I think. We've used co-production, and at least in England, that term has gotten enormous official sanction. In this country, though, Elinor Ostrom, who has a reputation and is the Nobel Prize winner, said co-production is a way of turning those who are consumers into co-producers. And I think we've got to, as we mobilize for change, that's a tool for change, for sustainability and for shifts in the paradigm. And I think we have to be, the more we begin to talk about that as a strategy for system change, the more I think funders will say, well, we want to be part of that. But it's uphill.
I would like to just add one more piece to this. I was talking to the development officer, actually, of Holy Cross Community Trust, which is this day centre for homeless in London. And I said, do you have the same problem in London? And she said, absolutely, the funders don't get it. They don't get what we're doing. They don't get how we're creating a community where people are benefiting in this way. So I said, well, how do you get around that? And she said, I stopped trying to explain it. I don't explain it anymore. I actually tell powerful stories and provide strong outcome measures of the areas that they're interested in. And I just live in the siloed world that the foundations and the funders live in, and show the outcomes of this work, and don't try to explain what's going on. And then have conversations so that over time we're building up a reputation around this. So that's how she handled it. But it's very challenging. It really is. We do know that. Yes?
I don't really have a question, but it seems to me the paradigm of this thing is the relationship between the doctor and his patient, or her patient, and that they can't work together unless the doctor respects what information comes from the patient and uses what he has with the patient. I think that's the paradigm that people can understand. And so the co-production comes as an elaboration of that.
It does. I think that's absolutely right, and that speaks to this gentleman's observation about expert and the non-expert. There was a hand up there, yes?
I have another maybe paradigm which I think fits this really beautifully. In my practice of Zen, we say that the giver, the receiver, and the gift are inseparable.
That's lovely.
And
I think we have tended so much to divide the world into a sort of transactional world where you pay some money to get what you want, and you have the power because you have the money. Or you receive services from a state that has paid money to other people to do the services that you don't have the money for. And the money piece is the sort of backing behind it all. And in many ways, time banking says the money as the medium destroys just what you've described, the reciprocity, the giving and receiving, the circles of giving and receiving, the relational aspect. It removes the relational aspect. Does that to great effect in some areas and to great defect in others. And time banking is a way of introducing a combination of the relational aspect and the transactional aspect, which makes it both extremely interesting, challenging, and productive of new possibilities.
I think that's a good way to end. Except, I remember when I started time banking, Father Fahey said, "I have good news and bad news for you, and I can sum it all up in these few sentences. We have no money. All we have is each other."
Thank you very much.